Hi, folks. Once again, Mark Toomey here. I'm a sales engineer in Ireland and Scotland for Veeam Software. It's an interesting company with a great product. I was really happy to join Veeam a number of months ago at this stage, really getting deep into the technology and dealing with customer questions around the product. It is interesting when you go out and you visit customers and you look at their unique challenges in their environment. Every customer has their own particular objectives. The people have their own particular objectives for Veeam, but there is a number of questions that do come up that I'd like to try and answer in this session. Now, there are a lot of slides here. We will go through them. They get deep enough. If you can imagine, a product like Veeam is made up of a lot of different services which combine together to get the work done. For the most part, end users do not need to know the real intricacies of how these things actually fit together, but they do need to know how the product fits together. And some of the questions I typically get is, do you need a separate physical or virtual server for Veeam Backup Replication? How much RAM, CPU, or storage space does it require? And how often can I use it to do things without stressing the resources to their limits? Well, the answer to all of those is, like any good technical answer, is that it depends. But what I want to show you in this session is that Veeam is a scalable, modular solution for environments of different sizes. You can really deploy this in different ways and really get good outcomes from doing that. So I just click here. Yep. When we talk about you can tell it's live because I press the button and sometimes nothing happens. When we look at the overall architecture of the system, it's at a very high level. It breaks down to a number of different things. You have your hypervisors. VMware Hyper-V and Nutanix AHV are supported as well. I don't have that on this slide, but VMware Hyper-V and Nutanix AHV are running virtual machines off of some form of production data store storage. That production data store storage, you want to get the data from that as backups, image level backups that you can actually transmit across your network, or be that Ethernet or fiber channel network, and write that in some case to a backup repository of some form. Now, if you're doing replication, pretty much the same workflow applies, but you're going to have a replica and not the backup copy repository sitting there. But above all of this and orchestrating everything is the backup server. The backup server is the brain of what goes on in your Veeam environment. It's where you put all the configuration, the scheduling, your data protection workflow. Everything Veeam does is versioned replication. Now, you're thinking, what has that got to do with backup? Well, a backup is a versioned replica. It is a replica of some data with metadata associated with it. So that's your version of your replica. That's a backup. And same way, if you have a replica, that's version replication too. But the Veeam backup server is responsible for the making things for actually deciding what should happen. The Veeam backup proxy makes things happen. This executes the commands of the Veeam backup server, and the Veeam backup repository stores your information and keeps it safe. We're going to drill down into each of these components as we go through this webinar, and it will really give you a flavor of what happens and how things work. The Veeam backup server. The Veeam backup server is, if I was to sum it up, it's responsible for indexing, for job management, for scheduling, and general orchestration. It's where you define your backup and replication jobs, and you manage them and you monitor them. So it is the center of control. It does coordinate the tasks, and it is responsible for setting up the system components. So through the replication console, which is the easy-to-use user interface for the backup server, you run through the wizards to create jobs that you would like to carry out and perform your day-to-day backup administration tasks. But the console sits over the backup server, and the backup server is responsible for the orchestration of everything. So the backup server has a number of components. If you were to open Task Manager, you will see a number of processes working there. For the most part, it's these things you don't need to worry about. There are two highlighted in red here, depending on how you're doing it. When you deploy Veeam, and I'll cover this, you can either use an embedded SQL database, which comes with the product, or you might have an external SQL server that you've chosen to use. These both have their own advantages. The Veeam Backup Broker service is usually only for, well, it's not usually, it's just for VMware-only environments. But you'll see other services in there, like the catalog service, which is taking care of the database, the jobs, the activities, the user interface, and the task coordination stuff. But all of those get installed when you install Veeam, and we'll cover the installation of the Veeam backup server, and they just run away in the background. And for the most part, you don't have to worry or concern yourself about this. The Veeam backup server is 64-bit Windows only. So it is 64-bit Windows only. For anyone who's asking, Windows Server 2019, Microsoft have announced that that's coming. We will be certified on that too. But as well as that, all the other versions of Windows that you can see here are certified for the Veeam backup server, and it's fairly efficient in what it does and in how you're using it. But like anything else, don't starve these things of resources, such as the CPU and memory. We do have. When you're planning your environment, we do tell you, we can help you calculate how much RAM you will need to make sure that you either don't under allocate the system, or accordingly you don't over allocate the system it's working on. I think just getting a general calculation which you can work on is pretty good. Disk space is fairly efficient. Really, the system catalog is going to be the big thing. So it's 10 gigabytes of storage for every 100 virtual machines in the catalog. Now that'll go up and down depending on how long you're holding on to data, but it's a good rule of thumb to actually use when you're sizing this. Network, 1 gigabit Ethernet, 1 gigabit per second Ethernet or faster. Nothing really in this list of requirements. Nothing too much surprising in there. The SQL database. So Veeam stores all its configuration data and pretty much the records of what's in your backup and replication environment in a SQL, a Microsoft SQL Server database. The full SQL Server and Express editions are supported. So the Express edition actually comes bundled into the Veeam installer, so you can deploy everything in one click. You can deploy a database, a backend database with Veeam Backup and Replication Server, and in just running through the installation wizard, giving it some credentials. But if you decide that you would prefer, or you are a large scale environment that you have an awful lot of virtual machines, an awful lot of data that you're working with, it might be better to go with the standalone instance of SQL Server, and then you can set up for always on and high availability and all these things. And Veeam pretty much, how does it take care of itself? Well, it backs up its configuration. The same way that you have a backup, Veeam will take a backup of its configuration and write that. And should anything go wrong, you can then come back. You can bring your environment back from that backup itself. So that's the SQL. The SQL database handles all the record keeping for Veeam. Comes embedded, or you can deploy a standalone system yourself. Installation. Ease of use is a very important thing for Veeam. It's built into the DNA of the product. So it is pretty much a Windows-based executable, very easy to install. It is a case of next, done, right? You might have to add in some credentials here and there to make sure things are going. But the core component, and there's 3 of them here when you're doing the installation, is Veeam Backup and Replication. That will install the server, help you configure the database, either use the embedded SQL database or select an external SQL database if you decide to do that. The other components in here are Backup Enterprise Manager. That comes with the product. Now, Enterprise Manager is used to manage multiple backup servers. If you had multiple locations and you needed to put different backup servers there for different reasons, the Backup Enterprise Manager allows you to federate all these individual backup servers together. So you can actually manage them from a single console. That comes with the product Enterprise Manager. It's in there. Unless you have multiple Veeam backup servers deployed throughout the infrastructure, not something you need. But if you do have multiple backup servers deployed throughout the infrastructure, it is actually quite useful. The Veeam Backup Replication Console, this is the component that you use to manage Veeam Backup Replication. Very easy to use. Just once it's installed, double-click it. It'll connect to Veeam, give it your login credentials to make sure you're an authorized user, and of course there are permissions in there as well to ensure that you get the correct permissions, and then you can just manage the system. But here we're going to have a look at installing Veeam Backup and Replication. Like any other form of software, even if it's open source software, there's always a license somewhere. So accept the terms of the license agreement, and I'm sure you will read every line of it carefully, like I do when I install software. But it's just you get to select that you accept the terms of the licensing agreement and click next. The license file. If you don't have a license file, if you click next, it'll operate in free mode. So there is a free community edition of Veeam, right? If you have no license, you can use that. If at any point you need to restore data out of Veeam and you don't have a license, well, you can use the free edition to do that. You just can't take backups. But here, if you are doing a trial or an evaluation or a POC, or you've actually bought the product, you would install your license file here. You would simply browse to the license area, click. You can also add licenses later from the user interface to ensure that you're fully licensed if you step up or engage in new features or whatever you need to do there. Select your features. The backup replication console will tend to come in by default. The default path, of course, is the usual C program files. You can change that depending on your how you want to lay that out in the system. So the backup and replication server, the catalog, and the replication console. There are some how do we put it, programming libraries and so on, usually provided by Microsoft, that are prerequisites that the application uses. If they're not available when you go to run the installer, you click install. It'll actually, Veeam will go off and get those for you and set up the environment. PowerShell is there. We offer a very rich set of PowerShell commandlets. So if you're into scripting with PowerShell, or you have something, some form of other automation tool that can use PowerShell, I know that something like Ansible can use PowerShell for automation. You can actually automate the system through PowerShell. So the PowerShell extension in there is very useful if you're into scripting your environment. But Veeam will automate the installation of those if you just press the install button. The usual thing, the default configuration, it'll set its catalog into a catalog folder. The SQL server, here it's Veeam, it's using the SQL Express, so it's Veeam SQL 2012, so that's just using the built-in catalog. It does come down to whether or not you want to use the built-in or you want to use an external. It's down to scale. For large environments, we're probably talking enterprise size. A standalone installation of SQL Server would be quite good, but for many other users, just the built-in SQL Server with the Express Edition will work just fine. And we do have guidance in the documentation as to where you should be looking at choosing one or the other. System accounts. This is the same as you'd expect if you were creating a system account. So you will have to create a local system account with proper permissions. You need local administrator privileges on the server for Veeam to operate. So Veeam will need a local administrator privileges on that server. For your SQL Server instance, if you're doing the installation, a new install, or you're using an existing SQL Server, it'll need credentials there as well. I mean, for the most part, if you're using the SQL Express, that'll set itself up. If you're using an existing SQL Server database that you've deployed and you have the required things in there, you'll need to put the credentials in there to do that. Port configuration, and this is the part. Firewalls, as we know, security people do their utmost to keep us all safe from external threats. Sometimes that involves not allowing traffic through that we wish they would, but there's some ports here that are useful for Veeam Backup Replication, and they need to be available. Now, we do have a comprehensive list of ports in the documentation as well for any security people who really need to get deep into the configuration in there to see what's going on and what traffic they might need to make available or might not need to make available. It comes down to what your requirements are. vPower NFS. Right, so what we're dealing here with vPower NFS is that there is a feature that Veeam is actually very well known for. It's instant virtual machine recovery. So instant virtual machine recovery allows you to actually boot up a virtual machine from a backup. So run it directly from the backup file and then migrate that into production. Now, while it's doing that, we don't modify the backup data. That would be exactly what you don't want. You don't want backup data to be modified after it's been taken. So what we do have is we have a cache where writes are written when this instant VM recovery operation is carried out, or you're using virtual labs for test and dev or something like that. So it's a caching area. And then when you move virtual machines into production, if you decide that you're happy with the running virtual machine from the backup and you'd like to actually move it into production and you have made changes, those changes in that cache will get merged in. But this caching area is if you want to use instant virtual machine recovery, as it's just a temporary storage area. The catalog is where it's going to save its database files more than anything else. So that's the catalog location. Then you're ready to install, and you can select check for updates once the product is installed and periodically after. We don't do an automatic push install like for updates. If updates are available, you'll be made aware they're available. This isn't the equivalent of turning on your Windows system and finding that you have updates turned on and it's been patch Tuesday and all these updates have installed and now you need to reboot your system. So we don't do that. We will notify you that updates are available, and the updates are pretty good. When we're dealing with updates, there's as well as new features, you're dealing with currency as well. If the hypervisor vendors such as VMware or Microsoft or Nutanix have made changes that might be that might change things slightly, or our product updates, we will have certified and qualified that and make it available in a product update, so that when you eventually do update your hypervisor, you know that you have that you're current with the features and functionality that are there. The backup server itself, all right, so I talked about that. The backup server itself, if you were to go off and you were to add, that should be a capital M in VMware, I am aware. It's if you were to go off and add VMware hosts to the system. I mentioned earlier, this is wizard driven through the console. You can see there's a button, Add Server. There's a button on the ribbon interface at the very top marked Add Server. That gives you a number of options. The server type support at the moment in the user interface, VMware vSphere, vCloud Director, Microsoft Hyper-V, SMB3, Microsoft Windows, and Linux, right? If we're adding vSphere, you can add a vCenter or standalone vSphere or a standalone vSphere hypervisor. Right, DNS name or IP address. I do when dealing with users and looking at one or two issues, forward and reverse DNS lookups. If I was to give you a tip, the tip I would give you is make sure that forward and reverse DNS lookups are working. So put in the fully qualified domain name or the IP address. But if you know that DNS is working, and you'd be surprised in some cases, people forget, they make mistakes, they forget, and then they wonder why. Well, connectivity isn't what it should be. If you have forward and reverse DNS working, that can be a major problem that you avoid. So get that done and put it in here. You don't have to use the DNS name. You can use an IP address, but just make sure that your DNS is good. User credentials. So you'll want local administrator privileges, as I mentioned earlier. So you simply you select the credentials there to log in to your user account, your vCenter user account. And then you create a new account in vCenter with backup rights. So you don't want to be running around in vCenter with applications granted administrator rights that they can do whatever they want. That's not good security practice. So what you can do is create just a backup user account that Veeam will use. And we do have in the PDF that is linked on screen, we do have the individual permissions that are useful there that should be deployed, and will lock things down to the bare minimum that you need to get work done, which is always good security practice. Just give the bare minimum and no more just to get the work done. Confirm the configuration. It's there. It just gives you a summary screen. You click finish and away you go. Scalability. We have a broker service. You might have an awful lot of virtual machines deployed in your system with vCenter. What you don't want to do is have the Veeam Backup Replication server continuously poll that vCenter system. Because that could generate a significant amount of traffic if you have a very large environment. So we have a broker service that caches the topology of the infrastructure in RAM. It caches the topology in RAM, so when the Veeam server goes to figure out how things are going, it just communicates with the broker service. But the broker service in turn polls the vCenter server to check for updates. So it does check for updates, but it does that in the background, so it isn't continuously accessing the vCenter server and generating an awful lot of traffic there if you have many jobs going on. So that helps with scalability of the system because you could have all these backup replication tasks going on, and that could generate a significant load on your vCenter server. So the broker service allows us to cache the information that we need there. Hyper-V. I mentioned vSphere already, and now we'll talk about Hyper-V. In Microsoft Hyper-V, same thing. Add your server, your Hyper-V server. And it's going to be pretty much, if you had a Nutanix infrastructure, it would be the same thing, same wizard-driven approach. I just don't have that in the slide right now. But you click that button. No, just pop back there. So System Center is supported there. Your Hyper-V cluster or standalone host. Now it's going to be 2008 R2 or later, right? Keep that in mind. 2008 R2 or later. We tend to support what Microsoft supports. So that just makes life easy the world over, but we do publish exactly what we support and how we do it. Now, things that are a virtual machine, that's all good. But if your hypervisor host requires that you meet the specification. Again, fully qualified domain name or IP address, same guidance I'd give you. DNS. Incorrectly configured DNS can, as we know, can create a lot of problems. So just make sure your DNS is good. Then you can select if you want to use a system center to manage your Hyper-V infrastructure, standalone Hyper-V cluster, or or just a standalone Hyper-V server. If you don't have system center in the environment, don't select this option. Select one of the other two. Same thing. If you're managing things through system center, select that option. Make sure you have the proper permissions. This is all going to look like what you saw before. Make sure you have the proper permissions. Then there are transport services. So the Hyper-V, there's one or two differences between Hyper-V and and vSphere, which we will discuss as we go through the presentation in just a second here. But it'll just install those two components, the transport and the Hyper-V integration component, and then you can have a task limit, which you can. The defaults are usually good. If you have more resources, you might want to go higher. If you have fewer resources, well, you should be pretty much sizing for the defaults. But 4 isn't a bad thing here, but you can go higher if you so choose. And if you need to go lower, okay, but maybe you should, maybe you're resource constrained anyway. Hit apply, it'll do the installation, it'll pop off there. There it is, pushing out everything that it needs to do, registering the client, detecting the OS, polling the disks and volumes from the system, and then it'll save the configuration into the Veeam configuration database. And then you get your summary file that here, yep, here's what I've done, here's what I've installed, and you can make sure that everything works. You click your finish button. Availability, you pop in there, just see inside the user interface, do I have I added my vSphere systems? Have I added my Hyper-V server? All of that you can see on the left-hand side. So you have that those pick lists there that you can simply press the arrowheads. They'll populate what is in the system. You can see that you have a Hyper-V server that's just been created and popped in there. Okay. So I discussed the backup server. I did say it was responsible for indexing, job management, scheduling, and general orchestration. The proxy server is pretty much chooses the optional. Well, I put it this way: it's the optimal route for backup traffic, right? So what this does is that if the backup server is the brain, proxy servers are the muscles. These are the data movers that actually move data around the place, that take your image level backups, process that data, and then send it to the backup server. So these can operate without the need. It allows they can be distributed, which means you could have one backup server, many proxy servers. You need network connectivity between them, of course. And what they actually do is they move the data around the place. They extract it from your hypervisors, and they write it to your storage repositories, your backup copy storage. And what you can do is that Veeam can be deployed in a number of different ways. There can be the all-in-one deployment, and there can be a distributed deployment. So all-in-one is where you just install Veeam as one monolithic application on a backup server. Let's say on a hypervisor or backup server. Let's say you have a small environment, but if you have a large environment, you scale out with proxies. They are what move your data around the place. So it's a source-size data mover. It reads data from VM snapshots on the data store storage. It compresses and deduplicates data, and then it sends data to the backup copy storage or to another backup proxy. That's what it does. It moves the data around the place. What are the requirements? It can be a physical system. If in some locations, maybe you're doing things via fiber channel, physical makes sense, or it can be a virtual machine running on Windows Server, sitting sitting inside sitting on top of the hypervisor, and it supports load balancing, right? So it can round robin traffic. You can install it both locally and on a remote site. If you're doing replication between sites, you're going to have two proxy servers communicating with each other, one across each link. Same thing if you're copying backups offsite. The system requirements, pretty much what you'd expect, right? The more jobs you do, the more memory, the more CPU you need. So if you want to move an awful lot of data very, very quickly, you're going to need CPUs and you're going to need RAM that can support that. We do have sizing for that. 1 gigabit Ethernet or quicker to move things around the place. Veeam Backup Proxy. Windows 32 and 64 bits are supported. Again, we'll be updating with every new release of Windows. We do certified for the new release, but here's what we support at the moment for the Veeam proxy server. Pretty much nearly the same as what the backup server supports. Transport modes. So I want to talk about how you actually move things around the place when it comes to transport modes. I think it's rather interesting when you look at how things are moved around the place. When you talk about a transport mode, what you're actually doing is you're discussing how Veeam will retrieve data from a source and write it to a target. So with VMware, Veeam Backup Replication uses the Veeam API for data protection, a VADP, right? So what you're talking about is it goes off, it takes a snapshot, right? It takes a snapshot of the system, read only. It reads, so there's a redo log, right? There's a redo log. Your snapshot of the initial VMDK is written to the backup repository. The snapshot's deleted, and the redo log moves back into production. Your changes are applied. That's pretty much the image level backup process. Veeam figures out the virtual machines and the data files it needs to extract that you have decided on the job that it needs to do and which data stores they're on. So Veeam does all that, but we do communicate with vSphere VADP to get that done. So you'll see a bunch of VM snapshots there being taken, and then when they're done, they'll go away, right? So these snapshots will be deleted. And if you actually, you start browsing into vSphere, you can see this is a temporary snapshot. It's been used by Veeam Backup. It will be deleted when we're done taking the backups that are required. So these are ephemeral. They do not last. Direct SAN, transport modes, right? Direct SAN, the backup proxy uses metadata provided by the hypervisor host to identify the layout of disks, right? The proxy queries then the hypervisor for the location of the virtual machine, the data store, and the host, right, pretty much then it gets the physical address from there. And then what happens is that those data blocks get copied to the backup repository. So direct SAN or direct NFS is you are communicating directly with the raw storage to find out what you need. So the hypervisor helps you identify what you need and where it is. You pull that off and you write it to the backup repository. This is very fast, and it's but it does have some limitations. It's quite quick. If you had a storage area network, for example, you could use direct SAN to access the data there if you had an NFS system and move data very, very quickly at the array level. Pretty much do it at the storage level. Virtual appliance mode is hot add, right? So what this is it's pretty much the proxy server communicates with the hypervisor and says, okay, what are the disks that I need to back up for these individual virtual machines? Those disks get hot added to the proxy, and then those disks, or the proxy works on those and then transmits them to the backup repository. So this is very easy to deploy. It works in many use cases, and it can be quite quick. It's a very quick way of doing things. Direct SAN, direct NFS are probably the fastest, but they require access to raw storage. The virtual appliance mode, which tends to be the most commonly used mode, is quite quick and supports many different use cases. Right, that's repository. Network mode pretty much supports everything, right? So the data blocks flow through the host to the proxy, and they're just written across the network into the backup repository. Now, this works very, very well. Network mode, it's easy. You can deploy it nearly everywhere. But the there can be an issue around performance. I mean, you are reading everything through the hypervisor kernel. There can be throttles involved there, so you might expect that performance would not be the quickest. Now, it supports nearly every use case, or pretty much every use case, but it is so you can use it in all different cases, but not the highest speed available out of the three. Still fast. Virtual appliance mode is faster. DirectSAN probably fastest. So the transport mode for fiber channel, DirectSAN. iSCSI, you can use DirectSAN as well. You can use the virtual appliance mode. NFS is supported for with DirectSAN, DirectNFS, virtual appliance, and network mode. All good. Local storage is not supported. Local storage is supported by the virtual appliance and network mode. So you can see that network mode does everything. The virtual appliance has, can do nearly everything as well. And DirectSAN has a limited use case, but can be quite quick. Hyper-V. Everything we do in Hyper-V is built on VSS. So it is pretty much even inside Hyper-V, everything that does is VSS. There are two modes really for processing Hyper-V shadow copies. There's an on-host and an off-host. We'll talk about that in just a second. But we pretty much, when we communicate with Hyper-V, we also communicate with Hyper-V inside the virtual machine. So let's say if you're doing application consistent backups, which we support for vSphere, and we support with Hyper-V. So for your Exchange, Active Directory, SQL Server, various things like that, we support triggering VSS to give you an application consistent backup, so you can do an object level restore later if you so choose, and it'll be consistent. So we have various Hyper-V components in there, and we do communicate via VSS to make all the work happen in Hyper-V. So with the on-host backup mode, Veeam triggers a snapshot of the required volume. The data mover, right, the transport service, reads the required data, and then it writes it to the destination. Again, once the snapshot is done, it gets deleted, right? So we don't leave snapshots lying around. We always clean up after ourselves. The off-host backup, same thing, triggers the snapshot of the required volume. The snapshot is then split off from the production Hyper-V host and mounted on the off-host proxy. So this could be a physical system, it could be a different system. It just snapshot gets mounted up, and it gets read by the off-host proxy, processed, and then unmounted and deleted. People have been doing off-host backup. We're starting to see more and more frequently that because of changes made in the latest version of Windows Server, users tend to use on-host backup mode much more, because there's improvements in Hyper-V that make it much more effective, that reduce the need for off-host backups and using hardware-based VSS providers, etc. But you can still do it; works away great. The off-host backup proxy server, you do need a Windows Server with a Hyper-V role engaged, and it's not required for if you're doing a backup with SMB shared storage. That can be that limited use case, but something to be aware of. But just stay aware that for your off-host system, you do need a system running a Windows Server running Hyper-V that meets the requirements. So from 2008 R2 upwards, and it is important that the host that you're backing up and the off-host that you're using it to back up should have the same versions of Microsoft Hyper-V. You want the same versions of VSS. You want the same hypervisor. You don't want any changes or to deal with compatibility issues between Hyper-V. So just keep everything aligned. Proxy settings. I'll just go through some of the settings here. So when you're going through the proxy setting, you add the backup proxy. You have a number of concurrent tasks that you can do there. The transport mode. Virtual appliance is selected here, but you can select another one. You can decide the data is selected automatically by seeing what the proxy can do. You can directly communicate to the storage via the SAN, as we discussed earlier. You can perform virtual appliance mode or network mode. So the data transport options we discussed earlier are in this area. Now, there is an option here, fail over to network mode if whatever you select fails or is unavailable. So, for example, if you're using direct storage access or virtual appliance and something happened, something did not operate, there is some issue. To ensure that your backups continue, you can select the option here. It'll default to network mode, which we know works in using NDB in every use case, and your backup will still occur. So that's just to ensure that your backups happen. So you can go off then and the connected data stores. So the backup proxy can either deal with everything it can see, or you can make a manual selection and say, I just want a proxy to back up one system. Here it's backing up a data store that's on a HP 3PAR, for example, but that could be any other storage as well, like VNXE or IBM or NetApp or Nimble. Maximum number of concurrent tasks. That's make sure you have the CPU required. We discussed that earlier. If you make sure that you have the CPU resources required. Enable parallel processing. That's to make sure that you have parallel processing and that things will happen in parallel rather than sequentially. Another option, interesting thing there, email settings. If a Veeam Backup Replication needs to send you any emails. SNMP, if you want SNMP traps sent to an SNMP system, a monitoring and alerting system. That's pretty good as well. And traffic rules. You can put in multiple upload streams. So by default, it does use multi-streaming to move data across the network. But you can decide that you want to throttle the traffic, I/O throttling, at particular times of day. If you need to run something during production times, you can put a throttle in there and make sure everything, it does not flatten your network with too much backup replication traffic. Same thing, throttle the network traffic, throttle it to how many megabits per second you want to do it, and you can select at all time or during specific specified time periods only. So if you want to make sure that during work hours that there will be no case where the backup system will flood network links with traffic, you can put in the window here that the throttle is enabled. But maybe at nighttime or on the weekends, you said, okay, it uses much network capability as is available. Now, some people tend to build a dedicated backup network to move just for data traffic. That's might not be viable for everyone. That's where throttling rules are very helpful. And you can put in the preferred networks for backup and replication traffic. Your summary, and away you go. Hyper-V, same thing, right? It's pretty much does all that, puts in your proxy settings. You get to manage, so you get to go off, manage volumes. If you want to choose a VSS provider for a volume, let's say you had a hardware VSS provider for a volume. You go through the process of, in the backup infrastructure tab, selecting the Hyper-V cluster, managing the volumes, selecting the volume you wish to manage, and then just changing the VSS provider that's available and the number of snapshots that you're getting. So if you added a hardware provider because you're using external storage array, this will be how you'd select that. And again, the selection tab in here is that you can selection tab in here is that you can fail over to the software-based VSS provider if the hardware one is not available. The backup repository. This is, I mentioned, the overall brain of, well, it's not the brain, it is the storage. It's where you store backup files and the metadata for backup and during replication operations. Typically, it's a folder on a disk, and a Windows server, a Linux server, or a NAS server are all supported. So you can use on-site local storage, you can use SAN storage, you can use remote storage. We support all that. You can also use specialized data deduplication appliances if you had a data protection appliance. The hardware there, going through the hardware requirements, same as you'd expect. The storage is probably going to be the big thing here, because the more backups you save, the more storage you're going to take from the backup repository. In the all-in-one appliance where you install Veeam as a monolithic system, it's pretty much all of this will be managed through Veeam. But in some cases, you might have multiple repositories, and they'll need resources to do things. Both 32 and 64-bit versions are supported. If you're using Linux, you will need Bash, SSH, and Perl, right? So if you are doing that. So what happens is I'm using VMware here. The proxy server moves from one side to the backup repository, and the VBK, VBM, and VIB files are pretty much how Veeam stores backups. A VBK is a full backup file. A VIB, VRB are incremental files. You will just see all of these inside that folder. If you were to go into the folder, you will see these files. Veeam manages everything in here itself. You don't need to worry about that. The repository types. There's a Windows Server repository, right? So that's pretty much if you're writing to Windows, the Veeam data mover communicates to a Veeam data mover. If there's compression or deduplication or encryption to be done, that happens at the data mover, and it just writes the data to your repository on the Windows Server. ReFS is getting very popular, the resilient file system, because it has some nice features because of the way the file system is designed. But that's getting pretty popular at the moment amongst the people that I deal with. Linux, XFS is a great file system we found performance-wise on Linux. Now you can use whatever file system you so choose, but XFS is actually quite good. But the same thing again, the backup proxy writing to the Veeam data mover, which is part of a proxy, writing to a data mover that's built into a repository and writing your data there. Adding a repository, as you'd expect, there's a button, add repository, give it a name. Is it Windows Server, Linux Server, shared folder, or a deduplicating storage appliance, which we'll deal with in a moment. Put in the server type. Limit the number of tasks, and this comes down to really the amount of data you want to write at the same time. You'd want to overwhelm your server. Some advanced options here. If you press the advanced button, there's a line, backup file data blocks. There's a use per VM backup files. You might get increased performance there. And that's very useful when you're writing to deduplicating storage appliances. And there's also decompress backup data blocks before storing. So what Veeam does is that it actually compresses the backup traffic as it sends it across, but you can decompress it if you're using a deduplication storage appliance. If you're writing to an SMB repository like a NAS system, you will have a gateway server, which tends to be a Windows system that actually performs the repository functions and then writes it to your NFS system. So the gateway server, we need something that can do the decompression, that can do the decryption. These things that need to be done. So we have a little gateway appliance that does that when you're writing to shared network storage via Ethernet or SMB or NFS. Same thing. Add those. Data domain. For anyone using inline data deduplication systems such as data domain or store once, you'd have your gateway server where you can install data domain boost. Same thing with HP Store Once, your gateway server, which is just a virtual machine running the data mover service where you'd install the Catalyst agent. Exagrid has actually a data mover built into the system, right? So you can select your deduplication storage of those. Exagrid doesn't need a gateway; it has Veeam code running on it. But for data domain and HP Store Once or anything else, you would use a gateway server. Pop in your credentials there. Same thing again. And I did mention the gateway server, which is an auxiliary component between the proxy and the repository. It's a physical or virtual machine running Windows, and it takes care of all the functions if you need to decompress data or you need to unencrypt it for whatever reason. When writing that to deduplicated storage or writing it to a network share, you do that through the gateway server. It's all nice and easy to use, and Veeam manages all of that, all those functions itself. I did mention Exagrid. There's a built-in data mover on Exagrid. So down in the bottom left-hand corner, there's Veeam code running on the Exagrid system. You don't need a gateway appliance to do that. Exagrid, it's built in. Veeam will recognize it as, oh, you have a Veeam data mover. I can use you to perform actions on the Exagrid system. When we talk about the scale-out backup repository, and I'm aware that we're running low on time, we talk about the scale-out backup repository. What that pretty much does is allows you to add different types of storage to Veeam and under Veeam management. So you can have different storage with different performance characteristics. It might be deduplication storage. It could be network-based storage. It could be fiber channel storage. It could be on-site local disk. Whatever you're doing that way, it'll all be managed in a software-defined fashion through Veeam. So we do have that. You can gather and consolidate all the storage and allow Veeam to manage all of that. It still uses the individual features of that storage, but you can manage that as a scale-out repository. When we talk about scale-out, I mentioned earlier, there's an all-in-one. That's where on your backup server, everything we talked about is going to be on there. So everything you talked about installed in one backup server, we have a lot of customers doing that. You simply install one piece of code, does everything it needs to do. In a more advanced scale-out scenario, you have things separated out on different systems, quite simply for scalability. If you have a large environment, you need to move an awful lot of data. You would have the backup server separate from the proxies, separate from the guest interaction proxy, separate from the backup repository. I mentioned earlier about, well, how do I make sure I use the best use of my resources? This is a way of doing it. You can break those out. But if you don't need to do it, don't do it. You don't need to do it. In distributed environments, I mentioned Backup Enterprise Manager. You could have your individual backup servers at many different locations if you had remote sites, and all managed through Veeam Backup Enterprise Manager. So Enterprise Manager taking care of everything at all those remote locations. We don't have to get too much into the advanced settings. Email, that's just the thing about if you want to send yourself emails, notify successes, warnings, failures. SNMP, I mentioned that earlier. That's if you need to send particular strings on alerts or other SNMP traps, you can do that. There's notifications when your disk space is low on your backup storage, when your disk space is low on your production data stores, if they're starting to fill up, and you can check for product and hypervisor updates frequently, and let you know if your support contract is going to expire. Users and roles. This is like RBAC, role-based access control. You can define different roles with different login credentials for people to make sure that someone's an administrator, another's an operator, and someone just can log in and view things. So very important that way. I/O control. I mentioned that, right? So we have backup I/O control where we can understand the latency of the data store and take care of the efficiency and availability. So the data you're pulling out and the data you're transmitting across the network, you can control, you can put limits and throttling and do various I/O control systems there. So even here, you can enable parallel processing. If you want to make sure that your production applications always meet a particular I/O rate, you can do that too, and you can set custom thresholds for how you need to move things around. You can see there, you can see the spikes, right? When things are enabled and disabled, you can see the read and write latencies going on. Once things are enabled, they start to minimize, right? The I/O coming from the system because you're now using the controls. And then when you turn it off again with disable, the spikes start again. You don't want that for your production applications, especially if you have service level agreements to meet with your end users. Configuration backup the config. I mentioned that Veeam will back up its configuration to make sure it can come back from if anything happens. If you were to lose your backup server, you can back up and encrypt the backup configuration file. Make sure you have that in your backup storage. You can save that somewhere else or in your production storage. You can put it on disk, put it on tape, put it in the cloud, whatever you need to do. Make sure that's available for you to come back. And restore settings. Okay, creating a backup task, right? Backup job, VMware Hyper-V, whole load of virtual machines in there that you can select. I'm going to move on through this. You can, yes, this is important. You can exclude disks, right? So you can select disks that you do not want to process for whatever reason. They might not have data on there that you consider to be important. So you can exclude those disks from backup. You don't have to grab a virtual machine and everything in there. Now, it's important that you check your exclusions every now and then, especially if you find, oh, I started a backup and the data isn't being backed up. Well, if the data is on a disk that you've excluded, it won't be. So just don't forget that. If people put in exclusions and you're finding that I restored this virtual machine, the data wasn't there, or I checked it and it wasn't there, it's probably being excluded. So go in and check those settings. This is why we give people permissions, different levels of permissions, that they can only do different things. Again, choosing a proxy server, automatic selection, etc., etc. Default backup repository. You can select different backup repositories in there for your backup jobs. Then select advanced, incremental. So the incremental is usually how it goes. It takes incremental backups. There's reverse incremental, where it'll merge the incrementals to ensure you always have a full backup available when you're doing a recovery. Now you can you can still get a full backup back from the incremental, but it takes a lot. It can take some I/O to do that. Then you can also create full backups if you so choose, during days of the week, during the months, whatever you need to do. And they have restore points to keep on disk up there. Restore points are pretty much how many recovery points that you want to go back from. Right. I mentioned incremental backup, reverse incremental. Yep. That is store, said that. Created synthetics, said that. Compression and deduplication. Compression and deduplication are carried out by the data mover service and the proxy. You can select compression levels. So there's an extreme level of compression if you so want to do that, and you can decide how much deduplication you want. Like for example, there are dedupe friendly settings here if you're writing to a data deduplication appliance. If you're not, you can crank the settings up and have Veeam really grind that data down, and you can encrypt the data with backup file encryption. Yep. So you can put a password in there and make sure that if the media goes missing, it's password protected and the key management is handled in there. So two keys are used, one for users and one stored in Enterprise Manager. It is AES 256-bit. It adds about 5% load to the recovery and backup. So it is software-based encryption. If you're using tape drives or using self-encrypting drives, that might be good for you, might be useful. Storage integration, backup from storage snapshots. Veeam does integrate with storage snapshots. What you can do is, if you have a storage array, which Veeam supports, you can use the snapshotting technology on the array to take your backups. And the schedule and backup window. I mentioned earlier about things around network traffic, but you could decide that no backups run at a particular point in time. So when you create the backup job, you can select it on the left-hand side of the screen. You can say, I want to create it daily at a particular time. And then you can also go off and blank that out, deny the time during production hours, to make sure that backups do not run during production hours. They only run outside the window. Summary, click finish. I'll admit that was a sprint to the end. There were a lot of slides in this presentation, much more than I expected. So what I will do is I'll probably start answering your questions now. And we will make these recordings available. So if you'd like to start popping any questions in, I'll start sending answers back to you. And that's that. No, I'd like to thank you for your time. I know we used the full hour, and there was an awful lot of content there. This presentation will be made available to you. So the email, the link will go out. So we will make this presentation to you, and that's it. So what I'm going to do now is that I'm just going to hang around and start answering questions. So if you have anything, put it in, and I'll speak to you again. Thank you very much. Might be better to actually read through some of these. SQL backup, long-term retention. With point restore, is it possible? Yes, it is. So I'm going to respond there. Yes, you can keep multiple years. Yes, you can keep backups forever if you so choose. Now, forever is a long time. You can keep backups indefinitely with Veeam.